to 8:17. It's a very dull Monday morning. It'll rain all day.
Hurry up, you two. The bus will be here in a minute.
I've got my new bag today. Got loads in it.
Have you? Come on.
Yeah.
That bag. How much was it again?
I got it on sale. It was $3.99.
So,
Yeah, it's quite good. I can fit a lot in it.
yeah.
It's really nice. I'm quite impressed with myself.
Yeah.
Goodbye. Complete rubbish.
Well, the bag's broken and wasn't strong enough to hold the weight of the books. But it wasn't the strap that broke, it was the way that it was attached to the bag. Now what Helen didn't realise was she used two straps to get to school today, and the second one was the seatbelt. Now a seatbelt again is strong enough to hold the equivalent of the weight of a large family saloon car. But like the bag, if it's not attached properly, that's where the common weakness can occur. If the belts themselves can hold the weight equivalent to a family car, so should their mountings. This is why the Vehicle Inspectorate sees the checking, installation and inspection of seatbelt fittings as so important.
This video is most definitely not a replacement for the inspection manual. It is guidance for best practice, and it is guidance for testers and people who wish to install seatbelts, and it can only show some examples of good and bad installations, but we believe it is a very useful addition to an inspector's knowledge and to make sure that he makes the correct assessment at the time he's testing the vehicle. But at all times he must follow the guidance laid down in the inspection manual.
The MOT installation check appears very involved. Behind me is Hayward Test Centre and Training School, and they've arranged a few buses for me to have a look at. Whatever class of vehicle you're testing, chapter and verse is laid down in the manual, and whatever manual you're using, the installation standard is the same. Well, I've got the buses and the manual, but what I need is some technical help from Vehicle Inspectorate Technical Trainer Henrik Kokoczynski. Hello, Henrik.
Hi, Sean.
Now, seatbelts, and in particular the installation of them, seems very complex. Where do we start?
Well, first of all, I can understand how it might seem complex, but we can actually simplify the matters and make them clear and understandable, really by breaking it down into different compartments. And in order to do that, what I've got for you this morning is a lineup of the different classes of buses. First of all, let's remind ourselves about large passenger vehicles. There are three classes. First of all, the full PSV, or the Class 6 bus. In the middle, we have a bus which has more than 12 passenger seats and would not be used for hire and reward. We call that a Class 5. And then finally, on the end, is a bus with more than 8 passenger seats, but not more than 12 passenger seats, but again, which is used privately, and that would be a Class 4. Now, because of the test you mentioned, the installation check, we have brought in a new class for the installation check in the case of each bus, and that will be a Class 4A, a Class 5A and a Class 6A. Let me explain that more clearly one at a time. We'll start with the small one. Well, the first thing with the Class 4 is the pre-check. We're going to do a walk-round check. That will establish whether or not the bus has got seat belts which are fitted over and above the legal minimum requirement. Now, if there are additional belts, then that will trigger us to find out whether it needs this installation check. Ideally, when the vehicle was booked for test, we would have spoken to the person booking the test and asked him, has the bus already had its installation check? And he will have some form of documentary evidence to produce to show this. If it has not, so there's no installation check yet done on it, that temporarily puts this vehicle into Class 4A. The first thing the garage has to ask themselves, am I a Class 4A garage? If the installation check is already done, then it simply becomes a Class 4 by virtue of the number of seats. So on the walk-round check, we'd establish what seat belts are fitted and what class of vehicle it's going to be, 4 or 4A, and whether or not we need to do this installation check. It's worth mentioning here that installation checks will always be done at the same time as an MOT. So the installation check and MOT will be done at the same time. There's quite a lot of work involved with the installation check, therefore there's going to be an additional fee to cover all this extra work. But the two tests are done at the same time. So this next vehicle. Now with the Class 5 vehicle, again the pre-checks would establish talking with the customer, the presenter, looking at the vehicle, whether or not the installation check had been done, and that would of course decide whether it was going to be a Class 5 or a 5A for a new installation check. The seat belts will be checked for all of the three classes every year for condition and operation. And now shown the Class 6. Again, we'd have a look and see if there were more than the mandatory number of seat belts fitted. We'd have a look at the documentary evidence produced. That actually brings up another important issue. Let's follow an example where the operator has had an installation check done at some time in the past on this vehicle. When he produces his documentary evidence and I do my pre-check of the vehicle, I now discover that there are belts in addition to those that have already been covered by the previous installation check. That will make this vehicle revert to a Class 6A, because to fit additional belts we now have to do a new installation check to see that those additional belts were also satisfactorily installed. And in fact that would apply to both the 5 and the 4, that at some time subsequent those vehicles with the fitment of additional belts could revert to a Class A inspection for the installation check, which again would attract the fee and the additional time required to make those checks. It is worth remembering that the installation check only applies to belts fitted to forward-facing seats. Okay then, let's look in more detail.
Henrik, why are the seat covers up?
Well, the thing I want to talk about here, Sean, is the installation inspection. Now, I would have known before I started inspecting this vehicle that an installation check was required, and that would require a lot of extra time because it's an in-depth inspection, as we said, with an extra fee to account for that. So I knew beforehand. One way of doing it, the way I would probably approach it, is where I ask my driver to prepare his vehicle, he opens all these hatches and lockers and all the access, and I'd ask him to remove all of the seat cushions, because as you can clearly see on this vehicle here, a complete inspection of the installation of these belts will require me to see whether this seat frame is securely attached to the legs, and then the legs to the floor and the legs to the side of the vehicle. So these seat cushions are actually going to have to be removed to facilitate that full and complete inspection. Now, after I've passed each seat, I would then ask the driver to replace the cushions, and then working my way back down the bus after he's replaced the cushions. I would then do a pull test on each belt to ensure that it didn't lift the cushion or didn't unduly compress the seat belt cushioning. If the belt does compress or raise the cushion, it effectively becomes longer. It needs to remain snug to the wearer, because if, after the passenger has adjusted it, it becomes longer, in an accident they will be injured as their body weight moves forward and hits the slack belt. One other point whilst we're here. With this type of vehicle, you're generally on a limited gangway width, and for the certifying officer, he's ensured there's a minimum width in here. If we had a seatbelt mechanism attached to the side of the seat frame, those seatbelt mechanisms would not be able to intrude into that minimum gangway width. Let's move on now and look at some of the other issues.
This bus is brand new. Surely when it comes for its first MOT, this won't need an installation check.
Yes, it will, Sean. In spite of the fact that it certainly looks the part, it looks the business, until such time as it's had its first installation check, this particular vehicle will remain a Class 5A. That installation check is always going to have to be done when there are more than the legal minimum number of seat belts fitted. So yeah, it's going to have the installation check. What might happen is the operator might produce a document, some form of document that states that it's done or installed to a certain standard. By all means he should produce that document, but it won't cancel the need for this check to be done. Still needs to be done.
The exception to this rule are factory-fitted seats, which have been covered by the type approval process which the vehicle manufacturer has obtained. Also accepted from an installation check are child restraints and disabled persons belts, although they still need to receive their annual condition check.
Retrofitting, however, with the older buses can be a problem. I've got a rig put together, and I think the time's come now we should go and look at some of those problems in more detail. Sean, what I'd like to show you now is an arrangement of 4 general types of seats that you might come across where seat belts have been fitted afterwards, retrofitting. There are 2 main types of vehicle structure that the inspector's going to come across. The coach-built vehicle that's likely to have what we call a wooden floor, and we'll talk later about supported and unsupported. The smaller vehicles, typically a minibus, would have been converted from a standard panel van, and what we're going to have is a panel van floor, usually with a wooden ply covering and seats then bolted to that. During our inspection underneath the vehicle, we are now going to see where the bolts come through. Those bolts should ideally be located in these portions of the floor where the metal floor could be clamped firmly against the wooden underfloor and against the seat leg, giving a firm, solid base. If the bolt came through here, this area here, when the standard washer is fitted, that angle in the washer is wholly unacceptable. And what we'd need is a contoured plate, contoured approximately so that we could get a flat surface for the clamping bolt to work upon. Now all that is technically very difficult. The simple answer would obviously have been to relocate that bolt wherever possible.
Now Henrik, that looks like a normal bus seat.
Sean, that's exactly what it is. And therein lies a real problem. This type of seat was clearly never intended to carry the kinds of load that would be imposed upon it by a seat belt when it's being used. There are so many problems, we'll certainly cover a few of them, but the ideal solution would be the replacement of this kind of seat with seats designed to take seat belt loads. Let's have a look at some of the issues. First of all, the simple and quick solution would be to fit the looped type belt. Problem 1 with the looped belt is that movement side to side, up and down, and backwards and forwards must all be contained within a maximum of 25 millimeters. There's your first problem. The second problem is this type of leg. With this type of leg, all testing has shown that the rear foot, when the seat is drawn forward under load, will bend downwards.
The answer is to strengthen the leg with a diagonal cross member in tension or compression and welded buttresses of similar material and gauge at right angles to the foot.
Of course, with this type of seat, every time you strengthen up one of the weak spots, you simply pass the load onto some other place. And clearly here, if we manage to hold the legs firm, now the whole seat frame is held at this point here.
The clamp must be substantially attached to the rest of the structure and secured tight with a suitable sized bolt.
But again, it would simply pass that problem onto somewhere else. So there are a number of areas where there's a problem. Let's look, before we move on, at the foot solution where we have an unsupported wooden floor. We wanted to know what would happen in an unsupported section of wooden flooring. And so to establish that, we've removed the top section of tracking, we've removed the supporting chassis underneath, leaving an area of unsupported wooden floor. With a test seat bolted firmly into a place and a test load applied to that seat, it became obvious that two main forces came into play. One which pulled up on the rear foot and the other which pressed down on the front foot. And those tests showed that what was called for with an unsupported floor was a plate, reinforcing plate, to be placed underneath the floor on the rear foot, but over the top of the floor on the front foot to stop it from pressing down through the floor. The front foot needs the standard plate above it, and the rear foot would have the standard plate beneath it, and this would prevent the rear one pulling out, the front one pushing in. By testing to the point of destruction, that is how we've managed to establish these minimum plate sizes for the various reinforcing plates.
These sizes are clearly given in your manual. Alternative shapes, for example round, are acceptable provided they are of an equivalent surface area. The sizes quoted are for mild steel. Other materials are acceptable provided they are of a comparable strength.
These plates, of course, would not be necessary where this is not an unsupported floor but has a rail underneath to take those loads and prevent the foot coming up and pushing down. Right, let's move on now to the next seat. This is a rather older seat where it had the quick release fittings into the track. Clearly, all the loads, and in this case from lap belts in this seat, would be placed from the seat into the seat frame, into the tracking, and so track mounting is an issue that we need to resolve from underneath the vehicle.
Tracking can be held by plenty of wood screws or bolts with plates, but the ideal solution is this continuous length of metal support strap, which, coupled with the metal floor tracking above, has created a solid and firm sandwich, making a very firm attachment. Oh, and by the way, you'll notice that all the seats on the rig with H-frame legs would need to be strengthened, unless the belts were anchored directly to the floor.
This particular type of tracking with the open jawed clamp, when the seat frame is placed in there, there is normally two small friction bolts that fastens the jaw to the open track. All tests carried out have shown that when loads are applied to the seat, the rear foot always parts and fails, and therefore there will be a modification required that will call for a bolt to pass clear through the foot, and this one's a good fit. This is an 8mm bolt with a suitable washer. It's passing through the rear foot, through the tracking, through the floor, into the floor underneath. There is also the possibility that some other method of attaching that could be used over and above the one I've just talked about, but if another method is used, there would have to be some kind of documentary evidence to show that that has been tested successfully, because this one has. This one's been tested and shows it will make that seat now hold. So there we are, the bolts through the floor, through the track, and bolted through the member that lies underneath there.
Moving on to another type of fastening, the parallel claw. These fittings are acceptable provided the securing bolts are fully tight. The same applies here with side rail fittings. Once again, the bolts must be fully secure.
This particular type of seat presents a number of problems because it has a tin base to which people are going to attach lap belts. Because it's a tin base, any lap belts attached to it would have to be supported with the 25mm washer underneath the attachment. Additionally, the tin base is only attached to the side wood panels by small wood screws, and therefore there's no real load path from the seat anchor through the base and into the wooden side frame. And so we're going to have to modify and strengthen this support.
So with the seat turned over, we can see the metal reinforcing bracket, which would be fitted to both sides, completing the load path into the separate metal side frame.
Two further issues are that looped type belts passed through here are going to run over a sharp edge, and that will damage the seat belt webbing. Another point is that if seat belts were attached too far down here and the seat cushion placed over them, when the seat belt was pulled, it's clearly going to lift the cushion, and this would be unacceptable. So the seat belt should be attached quite well towards the back here.
Lap belts must not be installed too high, allowing the belt to ride across the stomach. The ideal position across the pelvis will help prevent injury and submarining.
So Henrik, if the seat's only got a lap belt, obviously you need some sort of head protection from the seat in front.
You're absolutely right, Sean. Head protection will be required on this handrail. Now, any old kind of padding just won't do. It'll have to meet the standard given in the manual. Moving on to the next seat. This seat is similar. It's more modern. There's a more modern mounting to the track. Same problems with the track. We're going to have to look at the mountings. But now here's a 3-point belt. This 3-point belt would actually have to fail. If you look at the rear, one of the requirements is that from the centre line of the seat to the centre line of the upper belt position must be a minimum distance
Of 110 millimetres.
This one falls clearly well inside that minimum from the centre line of the seat to the centre line of the belt, and in this form, without further modification, would have to be rejected.
Also, the top anchorage must be at least 475 millimetres above the uncompressed seat cushion. This fitting would have to be rejected. The mounting is loose, allowing the diagonal strap to drop below the shoulder.
And finally, this typical minibus seat. Again, this style and type of seat, wholly unsatisfactory for the fitting of any form of seat belts. You can see here on those back corners, there's a number of pre-drilled holes. This is not the installer that's drilled those. This is what we'd call a universal mounting, where it could be bolted downwards, through, from the back. All of these holes in the manufacture of this seat have created a weak spot. This seat would instantly fail under any kind of seatbelt test loads.
It is unacceptable for tubular frames to be drilled to take a seat belt installation. Any exceptions to this rule must be accompanied by an approval document.
So Henrik, can you fit seatbelts in a double-decker bus?
Yes, you can, Sean. But clearly there are going to be all manner of problems. Seats generally fitted to double-deckers are just not suitable for carrying the loads of seat belts. They can, of course, be beefed up and reinforced, but that then passes the problem into the floor areas. Now, the upper floor of the older double-deckers were again never designed to carry those kinds of loads. Our problem is that we will not be able to check what the seat belts are fastened to. We're limited to a visual subjective assessment, and so we're going to have to accept it on the basis of what we can see. Not so bad with the lower deck. We'll be able to inspect inside the bus and then underneath from the pit. So again, yes, you can. All manner of problems. There are going to be great difficulties here.
Problems can hide at the back of buses and coaches. Behind the rear seats in many, there is a lack of adequate anchorage points.
There could be up to 5 passengers sat across the back of this bus, each one requiring a seat belt, usually a lap belt. If we look at the installation, and here the installation is to a tin plate, this clearly cannot carry the load path into the vehicle's frame or structure, and so we're going to have to look around and see if there is a suitably strong member. This bus actually does have one. This member here, this is a very solid member, and also it actually reaches all the way around until it fastens onto the vehicle's main structure there. However, it's of no value because it's in the wrong place. The load path we need is up here for the rear seat belts, and therefore there's no alternative but to install some form of reinforcement. Now we would use box section steel, 40 by 40, 3mm thick. Alternatively, we could use angle, 50 by 50, 4mm thick.
So that's what this is for then?
Yes, it is, Sean, and as you can see, it's a pretty hefty piece of kit. The critical part about that is that it needs to be installed, A, in a place where it can be anchored to, and B, and most importantly, directly to the vehicle's structure. That could be at the sides or in the centre, but the point is it must get attached to the vehicle structure. The operator would then, or the installer would then, simply go along here and make his installations directly to this supporting framework.
Here are some more poor fittings that will not pass. This belt has been pierced by an attachment bolt. Webbing must never be compromised. This unmodified foot is on a seat with a 3-point belt. Here, an unsupported thin metal panel has been used to attach lap belts. These belts use a U-bolt, which is of insufficient diameter and is attached to a flimsy bracket. The routing could damage the belt and lift the seat. Notice the nuts with no load spread washers. And finally, remember that all belts must have the lap anchor points 320mm apart, or be routed around a substantial part of the seat frame that keeps this distance. These would be unacceptable.
Well, the Vehicle Inspectorate are trying to ensure that there isn't any danger to anybody that is wearing a seatbelt that is fitted to any vehicle. A lot of these seatbelts are worn by children going to and from school and on school trips, so we have to ensure that they are not in more danger by wearing a seatbelt than if they weren't wearing it.
Hopefully we've given you some guidance on most of the issues, but you can always refer to your manual for support, and if in doubt, there are staff on hand at the local Vehicle Inspectorate office who are there to help.
So you got a new bag then?
Yeah, it's a bit better than the other one. It's a bit stronger.
Yeah.
Get it on the tube this time. Oh, you know, in science yesterday?
Yeah.
Right, we'll put my hands up to answer this question.
Sitting Safely is one of several Vehicle Inspectorate videos covering issues that concern authorised examiners, nominated testers and operators. An address for more details and where to order further titles is on the back of your video case.